The challenge that shut George Foreman up. The night was hot in Hong Kong, and the air smelled of sweat and anticipation. Bruce Lee adjusted his gloves, eyes fixed on the makeshift ring as a crowd gathered around him. It was not an official event, but a martial arts demonstration that had attracted both curious and skeptical people. Among them, a tall man, with broad shoulders and a disdainful expression, observed everything with an ironic smile. George Foreman, then a rising young boxer, had been invited to watch the spectacle. He wasn't the type to be easily impressed. With a history of brutal knockouts and a physique that seemed sculpted for destruction, Foreman looked at Bruce Lee with a mixture of disdain and curiosity. "That guy over there? He's not a real fighter," Foreman muttered to one of his companions, crossing his arms. "He makes some nice moves, but in the ring, against someone who knows how to hit, he doesn't last 2 minutes." Bruce Lee heard the comment. He didn't react immediately. He just smiled, as if he had already expected that. He knew Foreman's reputation, a man who had knocked down opponents with punches that felt like hammers. But Bruce also knew something few understood: fighting wasn't just about brute strength. When it was his turn to demonstrate, Bruce didn't just show off kicks and strikes in the air. He called a volunteer, a rugged, experienced local boxer, and proposed a simple challenge: let's see who can touch the other first. The boxer advanced with a confident straightforward. Bruce dodged with a fluidity that seemed to defy gravity, counterattacking with a side kick that connected with his opponent's chest, knocking him to the ground. The crowd exploded. Foreman frowned, but still wasn't convinced. "That was luck," he said, shaking his head. "In boxing, we don't kick. And I'm no amateur." Bruce approached, his eyes shining with an intensity that made even the most skeptical people fall silent. "Do you think fighting is just about punching and being punched?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. "So tell me, how many men have you knocked out? 10? 20? And how many of them really understand what it's like to fight?" Foreman laughed, but there was a trace of irritation in his tone. "I don't need to understand anything. I win. That's all that matters." Bruce didn't argue. Instead, he extended his hand. "So let's see. 1 round. No rules. Just you and me." The challenge hung in the air like a blade. Foreman hesitated. He was a boxer, trained for the ring, with gloves, rounds, and a referee. Bruce Lee didn't play by the same rules. And that bothered him. "You're crazy," Foreman finally said, taking a step back. "I'm not going to fight you. Not here, not like this." Bruce didn't insist. He just nodded, as if he already knew what the answer would be. "So you already have your answer," he said, turning to the crowd. "A real fighter doesn't need to prove anything to anyone. He just needs to be willing to learn." Foreman did not respond. But in the years that followed, whenever someone mentioned Bruce Lee, he avoided repeating the same dismissive words. Because deep down, he knew he had been tested, not in the ring, but in pride. And at that moment, Bruce Lee had won without even raising his fists. The last round. The years passed, and the legend of Bruce Lee grew like an unquenchable flame. While Foreman became world champion, crushing opponents with blows that shook the ring, Bruce went his own way, teaching, philosophizing, breaking the chains of what the world called fighting. But there was a shadow that neither of them could ignore, that of the confrontation that never happened. It was in 1973, in Hong Kong, during the filming of Enter the Dragon, that Bruce received a telegram. There was no return address, just 3 words: "Now I accept." He knew who had sent it. The place was not a ring. It was an ancient Shaolin temple on the outskirts of Kowloon, where stone walls held centuries of martial secrets. Foreman arrived alone, without coaches, without cameras, without an audience. Just him, dressed in a white shirt and linen pants, his wrists still marked by the scars of past battles. Bruce was waiting for him in the center of the courtyard, barefoot, wearing only a black gi. There were no gloves, rounds, or referees. Just two men and the weight of a question that neither of them had answered. "You came," said Bruce, without surprise. "I said I wouldn't fight you. I didn't say I wouldn't learn." Bruce smiled. It was not a smile of challenge, but of recognition. "Then let's get started." Foreman attacked first. Not with the wide, devastating punch that had made him famous, but with a quick, precise right, as if he had spent years studying not just strength, but economy of movement. Bruce dodged with a minimal turn of his body, and Foreman's fist passed inches from his face. "You've changed," Bruce observed. "You made me change." They circled each other, testing, measuring. Foreman was no longer the fighter who relied solely on raw power. Now, there was fluidity in his steps, an adaptation that only came from those who had looked beyond their own style. Bruce, in turn, no longer moved like the invincible master the world imagined. There was a new wariness in his eyes, as if he knew that this time his opponent was not just a body to be defeated, but a mirror. The first blow he landed came from Foreman, an open hand, a perfect T-show, straight to Bruce's sternum. It wasn't a punch to knock him out, but to knock him off balance, to prove that he too had learned. Bruce took a step back, but didn't fall. He took a deep breath and counterattacked with a sequence of quick, low kicks, aiming for Foreman's legs. The giant blocked two, but the third sent him reeling. "Is that all?" provoked Foreman, regaining his balance. "That's all you need to see." The fight continued like this, not an exchange of brutal blows, but a dialogue of techniques, a dance where each movement was a question and each answer, a lesson. Foreman tried to immobilize him with an armbar, but Bruce escaped with a hip twist that left him on the ground, looking up at the sky. When Foreman stood up, there was blood on his lip, but his eyes were shining. "You still fight like a dancer," Foreman said, spitting. "And you still fight as if the ring is the only place where things matter." Foreman laughed, a husky, almost relieved sound. "Maybe I spent too much time on it." They faced each other, panting, sweaty, neither of them willing to give in. But neither of them angry either. There was something more there, a respect that only arises when two warriors recognize each other, not as enemies, but as parts of the same path. "Enough?" asked Bruce. Foreman nodded. "He arrives." They didn't hug. There was no need. The silence between them said it all. Years later, when the gray-haired Foreman was asked about that fight, he just smiled and said, "I won. And I lost. And it was the only time in my life that it didn't bother me." Bruce Lee never spoke about the meeting. But in one of his last notes, found after his death, there was a handwritten sentence. "True victory is not about others. It's about what you become when you stop fighting yourself." And so, without an audience, without trophies, without judges, the fight that should never have happened came to an end. Not with a knockout, but with an invisible handshake, one that only true masters know how to give. The weight of silence. The years passed like leaves in the wind, taking with them the heat of the ring and the adrenaline of fights. Foreman, now a man with silver hair and tired eyes, sat at a table in a small restaurant in Houston, where a young reporter, eager for a story that would sell, insisted on reliving the past. But what was it really like? What happened that night? Foreman lifted the glass of water, watching the liquid tremble slightly between his fingers. The tremor was not from nervousness, but from a memory that still burned even decades later. "I won," he said, finally. "And I lost. And it was the only time in my life that it didn't bother me." The reporter frowned, expecting more. But Foreman had no more words. The fight was not won with punches, nor lost with a count. It was won the moment he understood that the real battle was not in the ring, but within himself. On the other side of the world, in Hong Kong, a woman with sad eyes kept a yellowed sheet of paper among her belongings. It was one of Bruce's last notes, written in his precise, urgent handwriting. "True victory is not about others. It's about what you become when you stop fighting yourself." She folded the paper carefully, as if afraid the words would crumble to the touch. There was no audience to applaud that moment, no judges to declare a winner. Just the echo of an encounter that changed 2 lives forever. The legacy. Years later, when Foreman was no longer among the living, a documentary about boxing legends was released. Among grainy images of historic fights, one scene caught attention: an empty ring, lit only by moonlight, where 2 men had met not as opponents, but as mirrors. No one ever knew what they said to each other that night. Nobody needed to know. Because some fights are not meant to be won. They are made to be remembered. And so, between sweat and silence, the story of the 2 masters came to an end, not with a scream, but with a sigh. Not with blood, but with peace. Not with one victor, but with 2 men who had finally found themselves. The last round. The documentary Legends of the Ring, Shadows and Glories premiered in a packed cinema in Las Vegas, a city that still breathed the smell of sweat and lost bets. Among the spectators, a gray-haired woman, dressed in an elegant black suit, watched the images with moist eyes. It was Clara Foreman, widow of the legendary trainer, who had died 3 years earlier of a heart attack while watching her last pupil fight. She had never known what happened that night in the abandoned ring, but something in her chest had always known that that encounter had changed everything. The day after the screening, a manila envelope was delivered to his home. Inside, an old cassette tape and a handwritten note, in shaky handwriting. For Clara. If anyone ever deserved to know, it was you. M. She recognized the handwriting immediately. M. Marcus the Lion Malone, the only man Foreman had ever faced in the ring, but with whom he had fought the hardest fight of his life. Clara put the tape in an old recorder and pressed play. The tape. Wheezing. Heavy breathing. The sound of footsteps dragging on concrete. Foreman, hoarse voice: "You came." Malone laughs quietly, tiredly, as if I had a choice. "You called me like you were still my coach." Silence. The sound of a lighter lighting up. Foreman: "I'm not anymore. I never went, actually. You always knew how to fight alone." Malone: "And you always knew how to lose." A dull thud. Something metallic falling to the floor. Foreman: "I didn't come here to fight." Malone: "Then why did you come? To tell me you miss me? What do you miss?" Another thump. A punch to the imaginary sandbag. "Because I don't feel it. No more." Foreman: "I came to tell you that I quit." Long pause. The sound of Malone stopping moving. Malone: "From what?" Foreman: "To win. To try. Of carrying this weight." Voice breaking. "I trained men to be machines, Marcus. But you were different. You fought as if every punch was a prayer. And I never knew how to deal with it." Malone: "Sigh, you never knew how to deal with anything you couldn't control." Foreman: "No. But now I know." Another silence. The sound of something being dragged, a chair, perhaps. "Sit here." More squeak. The creaking of wood. Malone: "What is this?" Foreman: "A confession." Pause. "I cheated." Malone, dry laugh: "You? Cheated?" Foreman: "The man who wrote the rules?" Foreman: "In your fight against Russo. The one in Moscow. I paid the judge." The sound of Malone standing up abruptly. The chair falls. Malone: "Son of a bitch." Foreman: "I know." Malone: "Do you know? You took everything from me that night. The title, the respect, my fucking dignity. And now you're telling me it was all a lie?" Foreman: "It wasn't just a lie. It was fear." Voice lower. "I saw you fight that day. I saw how you looked at that ring as if it were an altar. And I couldn't take it. Because if you won, if you really won, I would have to admit that everything I believed was wrong." Malone: "And what did you believe?" Foreman: "That boxing was war. That victory was everything. That a man was worth what his scars proved. Pause. But you fought as if the ring were a confessional. And I didn't know how to fight it. Silence. The sound of Malone taking a deep breath, as if holding back a punch. Malone, then why tell me now? Foreman, because I'm dying. More silence. The sound of Malone sitting down again, slowly. Malone, what? Foreman, heart. The doctors gave it 6 months. Maybe less. Bitter laugh. The irony is that I spent my life training men to take punches, and in the end, it was my own body that took me down. Malone, low voice, why didn't you tell me sooner? Foreman, because I was a coward. Pause. But now I only want one thing. Malone, what? Foreman, may you forgive me. The sound of Malone getting up. Footsteps moving away. The ring door creaking. Malone, from afar, I don't know if I can. Foreman, shouting, then punch me. Silence. Footsteps returning. Foreman, come on, Marcus. One punch. A single punch. Just like the old days. The sound of a fist closing. Rapid breathing. Malone, whispering, I don't want to hurt you. Foreman, weak laugh, you never did. A dull thud. The sound of a body falling to the ground. Malone gasps. Malone, shaking voice, damn. Foreman, coughing, was it worth it? Malone, what? Foreman, the punch. Pause. The sound of Malone kneeling beside him. Malone, no, voice cracks. It was never worth it. The sound of Foreman laughing softly, then coughing. Foreman, so, we both lost. Malone, holding his hand, no. We both won. The tape ends with the sound of Malone crying, low and broken, like a man who finally understands that some struggles are not to be won, just lived. Clara took the tape out of the recorder with shaking hands. Outside, the Nevada sun burned indifferently. She picked up the phone and dialed a number she hadn't called in years. Hello? Marcus. It's Clara. Long pause. I heard the tape. Another pause. The sound of Malone taking a deep breath. He asked you to keep it. I know. You are going. Yes. I'll tell the truth. For everyone. Sigh, it's going to hurt. It already hurt. Pause. But now, finally, it doesn't hurt anymore. On the other end of the line, Marcus Malone closed his eyes. Out there, somewhere, the wind was blowing over the desert, carrying with it the echo of an empty ring and 2 souls who had finally found peace. And so, between sweat and silence, the story of the 2 masters came to an end, not with a scream, but with a sigh. Not with blood, but with forgiveness. Not with a winner, but with 2 men who, finally, understood that the greatest struggle of all was to allow themselves to be human.